The phrase "be a man" is often associated with someone showing courage, independence, leadership, or assertiveness. But what is manhood? And what does the Bible say about the role of a man? In the series Defining Manhood, we will explore biblical masculinity amid great cultural confusion of what authentic and healthy masculinity entails.
Well, welcome to Meck's online campus. I once read a biography of a man named General Fred Franks who fought in the Vietnam War. While on the battlefield, a grenade thrown his way, known as a potato masher, exploded and Franks lost his leg. After months of recuperation and physical therapy, Franks remained an amputee in the Army, eventually rising to the position of Lieutenant General Commander of the 7th Corps. That would prove to be the greatest challenge of his military life, because while under his command, the Armor and Infantry Division of the 7th Corps provided the main coalition force that broke the back of Iraq's Republican Guard in Desert Storm, considered at the time to be the greatest American military triumph since World War II. Now, Fred Franks is, by anyone's standards, not just a soldier, but a man, what we might call a man's man, a leader that anyone would want to follow. But not many of us would ever think of placing ourselves as men alongside his life. We wear white shirts and ties, not fatigues. We drive vans and SUVs, not Bradley tanks. We step outside and smell smoke from our backyard barbecue, but not from artillery fire. The noise overhead comes from American Airlines. It does not come from the American Air Force. Fred Franks may be seen as a man, but many of us wonder, as a result, where does that leave us? Last week, we kicked off a series on defining manhood. And there's a reason. Today, men are deeply confused about just what it means to be a man. We have questions like, what are men for in our world? What are they supposed to look like? Where do they fit in? And if you find an answer, how do we know it's the right answer? Is it the hyper-masculine, hyper-misogynistic view that makes it all about sports and women and cigars and sex? Do you just throw masculinity away entirely as if it doesn't exist? Or do you go with what, if you were with us when we kicked this series off, and we talked about this last week, do you just go with the 3 B's, which is what most men buy into when it comes to manhood? The 3 B's being billfolds, how much we make, the ball field, how tough or athletic we are, and then the bedroom, our success with women. None of which, as we looked at that and thought about it, seemed particularly helpful. So we began to dig into what the Bible might have to say about what it really means to be a man, and specifically not just a man, but how to really embrace and step into manhood, about what a man is supposed to do and to be and his roles and his responsibilities. And we started with a look at what being a man sexually is about. And we found that according to the Bible, human beings are not only made, they were made in the image of God for relationship with God, but they were also made male and female. That when God created human beings, He intentionally created diversity. He deliberately made us a race of men and a race of women. We are sexually dimorphic, biologically male or female. And when the Bible tells us that, it's talking about something that really is hardwired into us, which means that sexuality isn't just about what you do or how you feel. It's about who you are and who you were made and meant to be. It's not just about what a person does, but who a person actually is. Well, today we're going to take another step forward into defining manhood with a look at the roles that men are supposed to fill. And there's 2 very significant ones that are highlighted in Scripture. And they both flow from a man fulfilling his role as a leader. In the New Testament book of Ephesians, the Bible records these words. They're really interesting. It says, the husband provides leadership to his wife, the way Christ does to his church, not by domineering her, but by cherishing. Husbands, go all out in your love for your wives, exactly as Christ did for the church, a love marked by giving, not getting. Everything he does and says is designed to bring out the best out of her, and that is how husbands ought to love their wives. Fathers, don't exasperate your children by coming down hard on them. Take them by the hand. Lead them in the way of the master. Well, you saw one word twice in there, didn't you? Men, lead. Lead. Men, you are to be leaders. And specifically, if you marry and have children, you're to be leaders of your families. Every family needs a primary leader, one that fulfills that role, and you are that person as husband and as father. And it's not because women are inferior or second-class citizens or unable to lead, but because the role is so important that it needs to be settled. It just needs to be appointed. When a team doesn't have a leader, it breaks down. When a business doesn't have a leader, it breaks down. When a country doesn't have a leader, it breaks down. God has picked a point leader for the family for a very important reason. It needs one. And men, God has appointed you to fill that role. But too many men either aren't aware of this role, they don't have this understanding of manhood, or if they are aware of it, they have abdicated it. They've abandoned their post. You know, I've had so many women come to me as their pastor in various stages of brokenness because their husband just wouldn't lead. I've seen children left drifting and aimless because their father wouldn't lead. They don't want someone autocratic or dictatorial or demanding, harsh or abusive or toxic. Again, this isn't about a toxic masculinity. We just read that Scripture goes out of its way to tell fathers to lead in a way that doesn't exasperate the family. But they do want someone to lead, need someone to lead strongly, kindly, wisely, lovingly, sensitively, with the family's best interests at heart. So when we talk about leadership in this sense, then what exactly are we talking about? If I had one word, I would say leadership is influence. Just influence. I mean, when you think of leadership, people tend to think of a particular title or position, and they automatically assume that if someone has that title or position, they're a leader. And sometimes they are. But true leadership can't be awarded, appointed like that. It comes when somebody owns the dynamic of leadership and then provides it. And that dynamic is influence. And the heart of influence is getting someone to participate in something, to do something, to go in a particular direction. So what are the ways that men are to lead with influence? What are the specific leadership roles that men are to fill? Well, I want to talk about two. Leading the family to be a family, and then second, leading the family to follow Christ. Let's start off with leading the family just to be a family, because, just because you have a wife and children, just because you live together in a house, doesn't mean you're functioning, you're relating, you're growing into a true set of family relationships. There's a line in the Bible that has always struck a chord with me. It simply and directly outlines one of the great purposes of a family. It says, God places the lonely in families. In other words, it's within the family unit that people should find their deepest relational needs met. Loneliness should be erased, and they should find their deepest sense of community. So who is it that is drawing everybody together and saying, hey, we're going to be a family. We're going to be a loving, functional, healthy community. Who is it that turns a house into a home? Who says, hey, look, we're going to spend time together. We're going to do things together. We're going to grow close to each other. Well, that's a leader's job, which means, men, that's your job. It's your role as a man. If you want to define manhood in terms of roles, it begins with being a leader who leads the family to be a family. I'll tell you when the gun went off on this for me. It was when, many, many years ago, when I was in my late 20s. I had always wanted a family. I'd always yearned for a family, had a dream for a family, but there's a difference between desire and determination. My life at that time was on a fast climbing track of busyness. I had a job that I had allowed to regularly fill at least 50 to 60 hours a week, easy, without breaking a sweat. I had started writing on the side. I was getting some invitations to do some traveling and speaking. I was finishing up my last degree, a PhD. And then over here to the side was my family, a wife, a young daughter, and then just 19 months after she was born, another daughter. I gave them what I felt I could, but that was it, what I felt I could. Before I knew it, my youngest daughter, Rachel, turned 2. I can't remember exactly when it started, but there just came a time when Rachel would get hurt and she wouldn't want to come to me. There came a time when I would come home and I would reach to pick her up and she would kind of cry and reach for her mother or her babysitter. She just became emotionally detached from me. And for a moment, just a moment, I started to respond by becoming emotionally detached from her. I mean, to shut off, to look the other way, to let my heart get small and to kind of resent her lack of affection. This kind of, well, she wants to be that way, fine, let her. But I couldn't do that, at least for long, Instead, I became overwhelmed with a sense of grief and fear. I had wanted a wife and children my whole life, and here I was dropping the ball. I was too busy. I was too absent. I was too distant, and it was flushing itself out already in a 2-year-old. I started to wonder, well, what's going to happen when she's 10 or 12 or 16? But I didn't know what to do about it. I felt trapped by my life circumstances. And, it's interesting what you do. You start telling yourself things to rationalize, to feel better about it all. Things like, hey, aren't I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Wasn't I working hard? Wasn't I providing for my family? I mean, that's what a man does. By working hard and providing for my family, I was fulfilling my role as a man. But then my breakthrough came. First, I realized, okay, I'm in control of my life. I really am. Nobody's making me work like a maniac. Whatever ladder I was climbing, it was my ladder. No one was making me climb it. The truth was I had begun to embrace a false sense of values. I would tell people, and I would tell myself, that I was prioritizing my life, God first, family second, work third, but that's, of course, wasn't true. I mean, I said that, sounded good, kind of believed it to a degree, but I wasn't practicing it. It wasn't happening functionally. Family wasn't first, my work was. Career was. Everything I was trying to achieve was. And I was saying that I was doing that in the name of family, which is a bitter irony. Even more, I had allowed what I did to define who I was. Something that men, in light of how our self-esteem is often constructed, are particularly vulnerable in buying into. And then things I read in the Bible at the same time all began to jump off the page at me. I remember one in particular hitting me like a baseball bat. And let me share it with you and see if it might hit you between the eyes like it did me. It was from the 127th Psalm, which says, "It's useless to rise early and go to bed late and work your fingers to the bone. Don't you see children are God's best gift?" And that just hit me. I mean, the Bible joined these two ideas together that I needed brought together in a way that gave me no room to maneuver. And it was letting work overtake your life as opposed to realizing the gift of children, the gift of family, the gift of home, and the role that you have with your family. It's like you're losing it and you're doing it in the name of work. And don't you realize that, you're sacrificing the greatest gift on the altar of that? It's as if God was saying, it's so stupid for you to give yourself over to your work and your career, fearing that nothing else will define you adequately when you've got children and you've got a family as a gift to enjoy and nourish and participate in. And as a man, it's your responsibility to lead. I began to realize that I could find the time for my family if I really wanted to. I was disciplined. In fact, I prided myself on my discipline in regard to every other area of my life. I would have put my time disciplines up against anyone's. When I worked and when I wrote and when I got up and when I went out of bed. Why couldn't I be disciplined with the time that I gave my family? So I literally began to schedule time for my family and put rules on my life. Every night, if humanly possibly, I would be home for dinner. And then I would be free afterward. Every week, an entire day would be totally devoted to the family. I got real creative and called it Family Day. And I vowed to do nothing on that day except to be with my family. And when something or someone tried to encroach upon that day, I had a standard reply. I would say, look, I'm sorry, I can't. I already have a commitment. And I did, with my family. And I did that from that point on for the entire rest of the run of my kid's life. From that time when, my oldest was like 3.5 and Rachel was 2, and then wasn't long before Jonathan was born, and then Zach was born, and the entire run that we had as a family of 6, I still do it. I mean, these days, we still call Fridays our family day, and it's usually me and Susan, but other times with one of our kids and their families, because what we did had such an impact on them that all 4 of my kids have family days too, every week. But that's not all. I didn't just need to lead them in the area of time, but how to fill that time. This is so important because one of the great temptations of our day is to confuse activity with community. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. You want to spend time with your family. So you say, for example, as a dad, you sign up your son for soccer. You write down when the practices and the games will be, and you make the commitment to be there, excited about how you're going to spend time with your son. But you don't spend time with your son. You take him to practice and drop him off, or at best stand on the sidelines. You go to the games, and when you do, you sit on the bleachers. He interacts with his teammates and his coaches more than he does with you. You'll have the ride over there. You'll have the ride back. That's it. Don't confuse doing an activity with building a community. Think what would have happened if you had taken that same time sitting in the bleachers and actually spent it with your son. Now, real quick, let me save myself some emails. This has nothing to do with whether or not you should do soccer. I'm not anti-soccer or any sport. I know you can up your involvement with sports, be one of the coaches, and actually have great time with your children. I understand all that. What I'm trying to get at is it has to do with the role and place of activities. They can be good things, they can be wonderful things, but they should never be confused, at least a lot of them, with the kind of time that is needed to build intimate family relationships. Let me just ask you a question to you men. When you were a boy, which would you have rather had? Your dad in the stands watching you play some Little League game, or a long walk together, a fishing trip, a camping trip, playing that same sport one-on-one in the driveway or backyard? See, I think you know the answer. You may have even played that sport with them in the bleachers, hoping because that was the only way you could get their attention or get their affirmation or get their approval, and you were hoping that that would then in turn result in the camping trips and the fishing trips and the long walks. I'm seeing more and more families diminished by a life of activity that is running them into the ground, leaving them so busy that they can't see straight. And why do they do it? Because they feel somehow that program after program and sport after sport and activity after activity is what it means to be a family or a good parent. That running from thing to thing is what's going to make them close and their kids turn out right. It won't. It's just making it harder for you to find the time to do what it does take to bring you together. Which leads me to another defining moment that took place in my life. As I mentioned, the first one was about making the time. The second was about filling it. I remember when Susan and I would plan out a family day or a family night, we'd fill it with all kinds of activities and involvements, gymnastics, dance, t-ball, maybe walking around a mall. We'd come home, eat, and then watch a video. We'd be together all day, doing event after event, activity after activity, chasing involvement after involvement. But at the end of it, we felt empty, like we somehow missed it. We wouldn't feel any closer to our kids, much less to each other. We felt like we were doing everything we could to participate in, family activities, but it didn't seem to be doing anything in terms of building our family. And I would get so discouraged because I was like, making these enormous sacrifices to have the time set aside to be together. And I thought to myself, hey, if this is what it's going to be like, to heck with it. I mean, it's not worth it. And then it hit me. Again, right at about the same time, my late 20s, when we were building our family at the very earliest stages. What was I trying to have that time do? Well, I was trying to get it to draw us closer together as a family. Then a little voice inside my head said, well, idiot, then do things that do that. So it seems like something very obvious, but it kind of evaded me. So I began to think about things that would allow us to just be together, not just be together, not just have fun, but to really interact, to really build relationships with each other, to talk, to relate to each other, to grow in intimacy. So we started cooking together more and grilling out more and playing in the yard more and taking day trips to places that created memories and offered joint experiences. We started doing service projects together, reading books out loud, popping popcorn and looking at family videos and storytelling while we did it, playing board games and the kind of games that have you laughing and talking and getting to know each other better. We ended up doing all of that and more. And we went camping and fishing and hiking and stargazing and biking. We baked cookies together. I remember one fall, I planned out something like 10 straight weeks of family days in advance. And I can remember most of them to this day. I remember we went to Mayberry Days Festival in Mount Airy. We hiked Crowder's Mountain. We went to a pumpkin patch for our Halloween pumpkins. We went camping, outside of Blowing Rock. Just things that threw us together, gave us stuff to talk about, real family time. And when I think of those 10 days over those 10 weeks and how it was just one small stretch, one small part of what that year was 50 family days over 50 weeks or so, and then 50 weeks a year for what was for our family a run of almost 30 years from when we had our first child, when our last child, got married. It forged us. But I had to lead us there and trust in its importance. I say that because I know some of you have been trying to do this and you don't think it's taking. And you wonder why you're bothering because it doesn't seem to matter much, but it does. I once read of a father, this has always stuck with me. He kept a diary. In one of his entries, he wrote of a day that he spent fishing with his son. And he described the day as a total loss. He wrote that his son seemed bored, his son seemed preoccupied. Though no matter how hard he tried to kind of pull him out into conversation, the son said very little. He even wrote in his diary that he probably wouldn't take his son fishing again. Years later, a historian found that father's diary. The son had grown up to be a relatively well-known person, and on a whim, the historian thought he would compare that day's entry with his son's entry because the boy had kept a diary too during that same time. And the historian was amazed at what he read. On that day, the son wrote that it had been a perfect day, that he wrote how wonderful it had been to spend a whole day all alone with his father. He wrote how much it had meant to him and how important it was to him that his father had taken the time to go fishing with him. And his father thought it had been a total waste. It wasn't. It never is. But that's just one area of leadership. There's a second one. We're to lead our families spiritually. Let me read you some of the most important parenting advice that has ever been given from the Bible. It comes from Moses, one of the most famous personalities in all of biblical history. Toward the end of his life, as the people of Israel were getting ready to enter the famed promised land, he gathered them all together and he gave them his final words, the culmination of his wisdom, one last life lesson, what God had most impressed on his spirit as they would go forward in history. And what did he want to talk to them about? How to pass their faith on to their kids. That was number one on the agenda. Here's what he said. He said, "These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates." In those words, Moses lays out one of the most important parenting principles that there is. When it comes to faith in the home, faith and your children, you are to be intentional. To use Moses' words, you have to impress it on your children. The word impress is from a Hebrew word, which means sharp. The idea is that when it comes to parenting our children spiritually, we're to do it in a way that is sharp, that's penetrating, that drives it down deep into their soul. It should be like a knife that goes deep. So you as a parent not only have to be the one taking responsibility for your child's spiritual formation, but you're to be doing it in the most intentionally penetrating, permeating way that you can imagine. And the person who is really driving that is the spiritual leader of the home. And who is the spiritual leader of the home? Men, you are. So are you leading your family spiritually? If you aren't, well, then who is? There was a national study directed by sociologist Christian Smith, a professor of sociology at Notre Dame. He drew from a wealth of new empirical evidence and in-depth interviews, as well as data from 3 national representative surveys. And it was found that the single most powerful causal influence on the religious lives of American teenagers and young adults is the religious lives of their parents. Not their peers, not the media, not their youth group leaders or clergy, not their religious school teachers, not Sunday school, not mission trips, not service projects, not summer camp. It's parents. Parents define for their children the role that religious faith and practice has in life. whether important or not, which most children pretty much adopt. In other words, speed of the parent, speed of the child. Smith writes about the dynamic as akin to parents setting kind of a glass ceiling of religious commitment above which their children rarely rise above. But that wasn't all that they found. They found that the role of fathers is particularly crucial. While both parents matter a lot, the role of fathers was found to be particularly crucial, meaning dads have outsized influence and, as a result, a very clear responsibility in regard to faith and the family, as in leading and participating in engaging conversations about faith with your child. But a lot of men aren't doing that. They are either into, and I've been watching this, they're either into drop-off spiritual leadership or hand-off spiritual leadership. Let me tell you what I mean by both. Drop-off parenting is when you drop your kids off to somebody or something to do it for you. You want your kids to learn football, so you drop them off at football. You want them to learn piano, so you drop them off at piano lessons. You want them to be educated, you drop them off at school. You want them to have friends, so you drop them off at a friend's house or a play date. You want them to know about God, so at best, you drop them off at a church. And you leave it at that. But that last one's a drop-off that won't work. It can support, it can supplement, it's of strategic importance, but it can't replace you as a spiritual leader. And then there's handoff spiritual leadership, which means, men, when you hand it off to your wife to let her do it. You know what that tells your kids? The leader of our family, the man our kids admire most and look up to and most want to be like, their father, he doesn't think God matters. And guess what? When your kids realize that God doesn't matter to you, then it won't be long until God doesn't matter to them. Because leadership is influence. And believe me, you just influenced them. Only it wasn't for good. I once heard the results of an intriguing study that I remember I wrote down many years ago and filed it away. I went back to it recently and I couldn't locate its exact source. But if it's even half right, it ought to stop every father dead in his tracks. And it certainly goes along with the findings of every other sociological survey that I've seen. But the study claimed that when the father takes spiritual leadership in the home, when he really is a spiritual leader, there's a 90% chance of his children following suit. A 90% chance that God will matter to them and matter deeply. But when the wife has to take the mantle of spiritual leadership, with the father in the home, with the father in the picture, it's not talking about single parent moms, which is a different thing, and there's actually, quite a bit of hope, that you single parent moms should take to heart. But when there's a father in the home, clearly providing a lack of interest, when the father is present but abdicating, only 15% of the children choose to follow the faith. That's how influential the father is. So what does it mean to provide spiritual leadership? Actually, this is not complicated. You can't lead people where you haven't been or where you aren't going. You can't lead your family spiritually if you are not spiritual yourself. You can't lead them to Jesus if you're not following Jesus. Again, speed of the leader, speed of the pack. So where does spiritual leadership begin? Not in what you do, but in who you are. You want to be a spiritual leader? Become a spiritual follower of Jesus. And you can be that man. I mentioned Fred Franks earlier. He said that from that first day, and for him it was July of 1955, when he first put on his fatigues and he took his place in line with his other West Point classmates, he said he wanted to be a soldier. He was asked why he wanted to be one, and he said, let me read. He said, if you like what our country stands for and are willing to fight to protect those ideals, you ought to be a soldier. If the sound of the national anthem and the sight of our flag stirs something inside of you, then you ought to be a soldier. If you want to be around a lot of other people who feel the same way about all that as you do, you ought to be a soldier. If you like a challenge, if you're not afraid of hard work, and think you're tough enough to meet the standards on the battlefield, you ought to be a soldier. If the thought that at the end of your life you can say or have said about you that you served your country, if that appeals to you, and you need no other reward than that, then you ought to be a soldier. Well, that's stirring, isn't it? And as a man, it stirs me. It appeals to me. But there's something that stirs me even more, something that is even more foundational to what it means to be a man and to step into manhood. Here's how I might reword, if I can, what Franks wrote that I know is what inspires me on a deeper level. If you believe that the world is in desperate need of leaders and the family is the bedrock of all of human existence, then you should not just be a man, but step into manhood. If you believe that children need a father to be inspired to love and follow God, you should embrace what it means to be a man and enter manhood. If you believe that heaven and hell are real and real people go to one or the other, and you realize there's nothing more important than seeing your children saved, then you should move from just being a man and join the fraternity of manhood. If the sound of a group of people becoming an actual family, where they're loving and being loved and knowing and being known and serving and being served and celebrating and being celebrated, stirs something inside of you, you should be a man and step into manhood. If you like a challenge and you're not afraid of hard work, risk, and sacrifice, and you think you're tough enough to meet the standards of leading those God has entrusted to you, you should be a man that embraces his manhood. If you believe a wife is to be cherished and a child is God's best gift, if the thought that at the end of your life you can say or have said about you that you led your family to be a family and that you led your family to Christ, if that appeals to you and you need no other reward than that, then you should be a man. And not just a man who enters into manhood. Because what is manhood? What's the role? In so many ways, you can sum it up by saying, well, he's a leader. And then you can break it down even more specifically. A leader who brings his family together and then leads them to Christ. Along the way, we might also be doctors or lawyers or videographers and programmers or bankers and marketers and officers or soldiers. But whatever our vocational roles may be, they will pale in comparison to our roles as men who truly enter manhood as leaders of our families. As leaders of our families. Well, next week we have one last layer to add to defining manhood, and it's moving from roles to responsibilities, of which every man has three that should define his life and interactions. I hope you won't miss it. Until then, let me pray for you. Father, thank you so much for making us a race of men and of women. We could have equally a series on the incredible roles of women and the responsibilities of women and the nature of that. So we're certainly not trying to be sexist and isolating men out or elevating them in any way. We're not. It's just that men right now are confused in our day, much more so than women. And we need clarity from you, Father, about what it means to be a man. And so thank you that we have it when we turn to the scriptures. And I do pray, Father, that those of us who are men will take stepping into manhood seriously and understand what that entails. The leadership responsibility, the leadership role. Anyway, I pray that for all of us in the name of Jesus. Amen.